That's all for now. Thanks so much for joining us this weekend. Now let's get into the message.
Tim Barton is a dynamic leader in American historical education and patriotic advocacy. As the president of Wall Builders, an organization dedicated to preserving America's foundational values, Barton significantly shapes contemporary understanding of our nation's heritage and focuses on the importance of faith and morality in American history. With a strong background in history and education, Barton combines scholarly insight with passionate discussion. He believes that people who are well-informed are essential for preserving liberty and democracy. Under his leadership, Wall Builders impacts educational institutions, government bodies, and faith communities across the nation. Barton is an engaging speaker and author and stresses the importance of understanding the true context of historical events and the foundational role of Judeo-Christian values in shaping American society. Through Wall Builders, Tim Barton inspires a renewed appreciation for America's historical legacy, advocating for a future where the principles of freedom, justice, and faith are upheld. We are honored to have him as a guest speaker with us this weekend. Element Church, please give a warm welcome to Tim Barton.
Well, it is my pleasure to be with you this morning. If you're not familiar with Wall Builders, we do a lot with American history and specifically trying to help people see some of the connection of faith in our nation, the Christian foundation of our nation. But if you were paying attention, we actually just celebrated another birthday for America. We're 248 years as a nation, and we have the longest lasting constitution from any nation in the history of the world. So there's actually a lot of really impressive things, yeah. There's a lot of impressive things about our nation. One of the many challenges our nation faces is most Americans know very little about our nation's history, and much of what we learn is not correct. Just to give an example, if you ever watch any man on the street interviews where they will go ask people, hey, what do you know about America? Details, it's usually quite embarrassing what people don't know about America. And I want to start off by showing you guys a quick video clip. So you guys watch the side screens and check out this video.
What country famously broke away from England to start their own country in the late 1700s?
I have no idea, man. I don't know.
What are we celebrating on the 4th of July exactly?
Our independence.
A little more specific.
It's the day that we overtook the South. And it's the day that, it's our independence. That's why we have the fire.
From the South?
From the South, exactly.
So it was the victor of the Civil War?
Yes.
4th of July?
Yes.
The Declaration of Independence was signed by who?
I don't know.
Just name one person.
Abraham Lincoln? I don't know.
Sorry.
Not?
What year was that Declaration of
Was
Independence?
it 1964? 84?
1984.
84? I don't know.
No. We're in trouble.
1864?
1860.
I don't know.
This country, no wonder this country's in trouble.
So that's incorrect, right? We were not alive for the Declaration of Independence. That did not happen. Abraham Lincoln didn't sign it. This is the sad reality, is most Americans know very little. And actually, sometimes we recognize names, and we often make the mistake because we know the name, we think we know their story. What we discover is most Americans don't know the story. And so I want to start with a letter from John Adams in 1813. He wrote to Thomas Jefferson. At this point, they're the elder statesmen. They've both been through the presidency, through the White House. But John Adams is reflecting back and says, remember when we were younger and the revolution was unfolding, like the era of the Declaration? Remember we came together and we were so strong in our sentiments. We had so many disagreements with our group. And he goes through in this letter explaining all of the different belief systems they had. He said, we were so divided, but then he says, but we were able to find common ground. And what he says is the place they found common ground is really interesting. In this letter, he says, the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. He says, this is where we found common ground. It was those principles of Christianity. And this is worth noting because in the modern education system, we definitely don't hear the idea that America was built or the founding fathers came together on the principles of Christianity, but earlier generations, this used to be common knowledge. In fact, If you go back to a professor from Duke University back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, her name was Alice Baldwin. She wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. And in this book, she actually identified that if you go through the Declaration, every single issue in the Declaration had actually been preached from American pulpits prior to 1763. She actually goes through the pastors that preached them, the sermons they delivered, and what she points out, her conclusion is that when the Founding Fathers got together and they're trying to figure out all these ideas, it wasn't their unique ideas they come up with. They were repeating the things they'd heard from their pastors the last several decades. Now, again, the idea that the Founding Fathers were influenced by Christianity or pastors is not a normal thought today, but it's only not normal today because we really don't know the story very well anymore. And if we knew the story, that the very first time they ever got together was September 6, 1774. The very first meeting they had, the very first motion was by Thomas Cushing, and his motion was that they should open with prayer. There was a painting done depicting their very first meeting together. This is the painting from their very first meeting. Now, clearly this is a group of men praying, right? The records of Congress, the official records identify the opening motion, the very first motion. And I mean, just think about it. You have all these people coming together. Many of them have never met each other before. They don't even know each other. What are we going to do? And somebody's like, hey, I think we should start with prayer. They talk about it. That's a good idea. Well, they determine they should bring in the local pastor, the Reverend Jacob Duché. He comes in, and the records of Congress identify. That opening prayer lasted for nearly 2 hours. I don't know how spiritual you feel this morning, right? I love Jesus a lot. We hang out all the time. We're good buddies. But 2 hours is a long time to pray. Well, actually, the records indicate. And even the guys who were they wrote about this. They actually, in the midst of prayer, somebody suggested, hey, maybe we should read something from the Bible too. And so they pulled out, at that time it was known as the Book of Common Prayer, and it was an Anglican prayer book from the 1600s, and in this prayer book, it actually had a Bible reading plan that would tell you the verses, the chapters you should read on any given day. And for that day, there were 4 chapters ascribed to be read on that day. And they said, well, let's read these chapters. As they were reading them, one of the things they read so encouraged them, and this is from their own writings, so encouraged them that they were convinced that God was on their side and was going to help them. In fact, one of the delegates wrote that that passage was accidentally extremely applicable to our situation. Meaning, like, they didn't try to find the thing that was going to encourage them the most. They were like, we're just reading the Bible, and it was like, this is so relevant, God's speaking to us. One of the guys who wrote about it was John Adams. John Adams writes Abigail, and he says, Abigail, you have got to read what we read. This is part of his letter. He says, I must beg you to read that psalm. Read the 35th Psalm to your friends. Read it to your father. Her father was the Reverend John Smith, the pastor of their home church. Okay? But it's Psalm 35 is what he wrote about. Well, Psalm 35 is one of the Psalms that David writes where King Saul is chasing him. And David says, God, I've done nothing wrong, and he seeks my destruction. He wants to kill me. God, you rise up and be my shield and buckler. You be my strong right arm. This is Psalm 35, and they're reading, and they're like, this is exactly what's happening to us. And they actually were convinced that God was speaking this as an encouragement to them. Well, then John Adams writes another letter to Abigail and tells her what else Congress did. He says, we have appointed a continental fast. Now think through the sequence. The very first time Congress meets, the very first proposal in the committee is we open with prayer. Their prayer lasts for 2 hours. In the midst of 2-hour prayer, they read the Bible. They read a psalm that so speaks to them and encourages them. And then they call for a day of prayer and fasting for all of the colonies. And in this letter, John Adams tells Abigail, millions be upon their knees at once before their great creator, imploring his forgiveness and blessings, his smiles on American council and arms. So John Adams is saying, Abigail, this is going to be amazing. Millions of people are going to be praying. There were only about 3 million colonists at that time. So for him to think that millions of people are going to pray, he's assuming that everybody in America is going to be praying. That's probably naive, right? Like, probably not everybody prayed, but certainly it was a significant time of prayer. And if we look back historically, there's a lot of people who'd go, wait a second. I mean, you're saying Congress had a day they're calling people to pray? Oh, this was quite common in early America. So much so that by 1815, there were more than 1,400 official government prayer proclamations that came from governors, from presidents, or from Congress. Now, a couple important things about this. We often hear today, well, the founding fathers, they weren't really religious. And this is my favorite thing to point to when someone says that, because if they say, well, they weren't religious, then I want to know, then why did they pray all the time, right? Well, they were atheists, agnostics, and deists. Okay, then why did they pray all the time? Because an atheist believes there is no God. An agnostic is not sure there's a God. And a deist says, well, there is a God, but he doesn't get involved in our lives. Then you wouldn't do any of this. And even to go further, some people say, but there's a separation of church and state, right? Well, then why did every single founding father who became a governor call on their state to times of prayer and fasting or prayer and things? Because that violates the separation of church and state. Well, it only violates our modern interpretation of it. Because if you actually go back, where does that phrase come from? It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. It was in a private letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, who were afraid that there might come a time when our federal government would pick an established religion. Now, why would they think that? Because in Europe, that's what everybody had done. In England, you had to be Anglican. In France, you had to be Catholic. In Germany, you had to be Lutheran. And they said, we're afraid that in America, that we're going to have a president who's going to say we all have to be a denomination. And Jefferson writes back and like, guys, you do not need to worry about that. He says, we have already erected a wall of separation between church and state through the First Amendment, which will forever protect your religious freedom. The wall of separation was recognizing the separation of institutions, but separate institutions does not argue secular institutions. We have a separation of church and state, but not a secularization of church and state. This is an easy example to show that, right? But let me go back to the first Congress, because in the first Congress, they actually had 15 proclamations during the American Revolution alone. And so 15 calls to prayer, and there were two different kinds. There was one for prayer and fasting, because if you need God's intervention, we need God's help, we need to get serious about this. So you pray and you fast. But then if you've prayed and fasted and asked for God to intervene, and something happens, and you're like, I think God showed up. What is the logical response every Christian's supposed to do? If you pray and God answers a prayer, you need to thank God for what he did. So they would do days of prayer and thanksgiving to thank God for God's intervention based on their earlier prayers. This happened 15 times in the Revolution. Well, the very first one was a day of prayer and fasting. And it wasn't very long after this time of prayer and fasting that John Adams writes Abigail another letter. And he says, Abigail, it's amazing what we're seeing happen. And he actually goes through this letter and talks about how there was a group of militiamen who were able to repel the British forces when they came. And he starts giving these examples. But the one that strikes me as the most interesting, he says, we just destroyed a 64-gun British man of warship and a 20-gun British man of warship. Now, why does that matter? Because we didn't have a navy yet. Okay, Great Britain is the number one military power in the world, and they're number one in the world largely because they have the number one navy in the world. We were British colonists. We were British citizens, so the British Navy was our navy. But once we separate, the British Navy is now opposing us, and we don't have any vessels of war. We did have businessmen in America, and they had ships they would use for trade. So we took whatever boats, whatever ships we could find. We take whatever cannons we could get our hands on, and we would put those on the boats. But these were not naval war vessels. And to give even further context, if you ever go to Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum of American History, up on the third floor, they have one of the very first gunboats of the American Navy. It's called the Gunboat Philadelphia. This is the Gunboat Philadelphia. Okay, John Adams says, Abigail, it's amazing. We just destroyed a 64-gun British man of warship and a 20-gun British man of warship. And my question is, how? Did you like row really fast in their direction? Right? Like, this is crazy. Right. They begin to recognize things were happening that don't make a lot of sense, and they're happening in our favor. And there's another letter where John Adams writes Abigail. This one's 1777. Now, I've also, to this point, I've referenced a lot of John Adams' letters, and partly because I want you to have an easy place to go find them. He's not the only one that wrote about this, but his letters are very accessible. In fact, his letters between him and Abigail, his wife, between the American Revolution and the end of their life, they wrote 1,100 letters back and forth. And so if you want to dig in and learn some, great resource, and if you are someone who enjoys Hallmark movies, you would love their letters. Because John Adams is like this hopeless romantic, and I mean, genuinely, some of his letters, you're like, that's a terrible line from a Hallmark movie. He has a letter where he says, Abigail, I'm suffocating because I haven't seen you in a week and a half, and you are the air that I breathe. You're Hallmark people, I know, like, right? But here's the reality. If that was in a Hallmark movie, we'd be like, oh, that line's stupid. That's a terrible line. No one says that in real life except this guy. This guy said that in real life, okay? So their writings are very accessible, but the reason I point this out, you can go look all these letters up. 1777, he writes Abigail. He says, Abigail, I was eating dinner tonight, and there were men at a table eating dinner behind me, and they were talking about all of these unlikely things that have been happening. And they were trying to come up with what's the best explanation for what's been going on. He said, and their conclusion is, I think the best explanation for what's actually happening right now, here's what he wrote Abigail was the conclusion. He said, it appears to me the eternal Son of God is operating powerfully against the British nation. So they're trying to figure out, how do we explain all these unlikely things happening? And someone's like, I know, it's Jesus. And they're like, I totally agree. Now, let's walk through this for a second. This is not the answer of someone who believes separation of church and state. This is not the answer of someone who's not sure if God's even real. These are the answer of people who not only know there's a God, these are from people that have been praying and asking for God to intervene, and then recognizing all these crazy things that are happening that make no sense. It only could have happened if God was helping us and God was on our side. Now, this letter's from 1777. This is still super early in the revolution, but it was already clear even then that God was moving and helping them. Well, what have they seen to this point that makes it super obvious to them? Let me walk you through a few stories, early revolution, that people begin to see and realize, I think something's happening. For example, about a month and a half after the Declaration of Independence, you have what's known as the Battle of Long Island, or the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, it was also called. This is where the British had more than 30,000 troops. They pinned Washington and 9,000 troops in New York up against the river. And at this point, the river's a mile wide. Most Americans don't know how to swim, so they're stuck. And they're outnumbered more than 3-1. And this is also the era where everybody has a musket, right? So there's some people, forgetting historic context, be like, yeah, but we're Americans. We beat everybody. Okay, like, I appreciate your military pride. However, this was single-shot muskets, and they outnumbered us more than 3-1. Like, numbers make a difference in these kind of things, right? They were stuck. And as they are stuck, Washington realizes that we're just in a waiting game now, because we have nowhere we can go. We're ultimately in a position very precarious. We could be captured, we could be killed, and if they're captured, he for sure is going to be executed. As they're waiting, the British Navy begins sailing up the river. And Washington knows, right, if they get behind us, now we're fully enclosed, it's for sure over. This is when the first of the unlikely things happens in this battle. As the British Navy is sailing up, out of nowhere, this massive storm comes in. And the storm was so significant that the British Navy had to pull their fleet out because they were afraid, right? They might get blown into rocks or up on ground. So they say, okay, we got to pull our boats back. So they pull the fleet back. And as the fleet comes back, Washington realizes we have to get off this island, right? Because as soon as the storm calms, they're coming back. Well, the storm stayed through the evening. And it wasn't until nightfall when it calmed, which is also important because if they were going to get off, they would much rather have calm waters trying to get across that river. Well, Washington says, we have to find anything that floats, and we're going to use this to evacuate. So they find some canoes and flat-bottom boats, and then they begin the evacuation. Now, there's 9,000 troops. So they found some canoes and flat-bottom boats, but there's only so many people you can fit on a canoe at a time, right? And they're having to go a mile across and a mile back. So they begin this evacuation, but as they're going through the night, there's no way they're going to get everybody off before the next morning gets there. Well, they work all night long. As the dawn of the next morning begins to come, there's more than 1,000 troops left, and George Washington is part of that group. Because George Washington, arguing with his officers, had said, hey, I'm going to be the last one off the island. And you can imagine, they're like, no, sir, that's a terrible idea. We're getting you off first. And he says, no, I'm not abandoning the men. I'm not that kind of leader. I'm going to make sure my men are taken care of, and then I'm getting off. So Washington stayed behind. The dawn of the next morning is on its way. There's more than 1,000 troops left, and they're going against 30,000. They know as soon as the light appears, the British are going to see we're evacuating. They're going to advance, and now it's 30,000 against 1,000 for sure. We're all captured or killed. Except, before the light of dawn exposes them, something else interesting happens. A fog lifts up off the river, and it came and it settled between both of the camps. And the British could not see what was happening as they continued the evacuation. One of the guys who was there, his name was Major Benjamin Talmadge. He was the head of what became known as a Culper spy ring. There were many spy rings in the Revolution. The most famous, probably the Culper spy ring. He's the guy in charge of it. He was there that day. Here's what he said about that morning. He said, a very dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well. And so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. Right? So from me to the front row, he's like, I couldn't even see a person there. So the British can't see anything they're doing. They continue the evacuation. When they load the last 3 boats, they get out to the middle of the river, and the fog lifts. The British realize the camp's empty. They advance. The British reported that they made it to the edge of the river in time to see the last 3 boats get to the other side and unload on the other side, which would have been where George Washington was, right? The last boat going off. So they literally identified, they watched the last 3 boats unload on the other side. The Americans had escaped and lived to fight another day. And this is where the Americans were like, whoa, right? Because like, what are the odds we're about to be surrounded? Like, we're pinned against the river, Navy's coming up, and a storm comes in out of nowhere. And the storm stays until the evening, and then it goes away because, like, had the storm left early, the British can just sail their fleet back up. But at nighttime, they're not going to sail their boats up because they don't know this waterway. They don't know where there's rocks or the river's dangerous. So they have to keep out, and they begin the evacuation. We're never going to make it in time. And then providentially, this fog comes, and it's between us, right? Like, if you haven't read Exodus recently, go back, Israelites, Red Sea, Pharaoh's army. Like, this is the American version of that story, okay? As they're waiting, the fog stays there. Nobody can see anything until we get all the way off, and then the fog lifts. They're like, that doesn't seem very likely. And they begin to wonder. Now, if this would have been the only thing that happened, you might could have excused it away and been like, they are the luckiest military in the world. But this wasn't the only time it happened. They saw God intervene over and over and over again, and often through weather. And this was a big deal. It's the reason I use this example, is because this was not something that any of them could control. Something beyond their control was showing up, and it was doing something advantageous for them to help them. Well, this ultimately was a loss, but God kept them alive. Well, as the year goes on, all they do is lose. In fact, if you go through their many defeats, starting with the Battle of Long Island, they lose the Battle of Kips Bay, they lose the Battle of White Plains, they lose the Battle of Fort Washington, they lose the Battle of Fort Lee, they lose all of New York. And Washington is in a very tough predicament because back then, enlistments were only for 1 year in the Continental Army, and they were up in December. So no matter when you sign up, January, February, March, April, they're always up in December, and all they've done is lose the whole time. And Washington is like, hey guys, round 2, here we go, right? If all you've done is lose, I mean, this is like being a Dallas Cowboy fan in the playoffs. It's the worst. It is the worst, right? Because you're like, why do we even try? We know we're going to lose. Right. I mean, okay, I'm from Texas. It's just painful, okay? Just pray with us. Okay, this is Washington's scenario. He's trying to get people to sign up, and all they've done is lose. So Washington knows we're going to have to do something different because morale's at an all-time low in the military. They're already having people desert because they're going, why are we even staying here, right? If we're already losing, then I'd rather go home and be warm at my own farm, in my own house, and there's a fireplace, and be with my wife and my kids. Like, this is crazy, and he can't get anybody to sign up for round 2. So Washington says, okay, new idea. We have to have a victory before enlistments are over so that we change the narrative and perspective and maybe give people hope that think there can be a possibility. So he says, what's the closest fort to where they're stationed? And they looked at Fort Trenton. Fort Trenton was being operated by the German Hessians who were mercenaries on the British side. And Washington says, okay, on Christmas night, we are going to cross the Delaware. We're going to march on Trenton, and we're going to attack the Hessians. Now, why Christmas night? Well, there's some speculation that they knew that Germans like to celebrate on special nights, special occasions, right? And if Germans like to celebrate in special ways, this is not a bad military strategy. If I know I have to fight somebody, I'm going to wait till you're drunk, right? Like, it's not the worst strategy, or like the next morning, hangover, headache, whatever. But Washington says, we're going to march on Trenton. Estimates are from Trenton, it was going to be between 12 and 1,500 troops that were there. Washington says, we're going to go at night. And we're going to cross the Delaware in 3 locations so we can kind of surround them. He actually sent word to another army unit that was north, and you guys march down. He's thinking, we're going to have 7,000 or 8,000 people there. We're going to have this incredible numerical advantage, and we're going to win the Battle of Trenton, change all perspective. So as he comes up with this idea, initially they want to be across the Delaware by midnight, and the guy in charge of the crossing where they were was General Henry Knox. I'm going to come back to something he wrote later, but I just want to point out, he's the guy in charge of that crossing. Washington's idea, the 3 crossing locations, they were going to have about 5,400 troops, which is cannons, horses, everything there in these 3 locations. Well, when they begin crossing, they were not prepared for Christmas night up on the Delaware, right, New York, New Jersey area. That winter and that night was brutal. Well, they are incredibly delayed. And this is Washington's location. They're incredibly delayed by the ice flows. Washington doesn't know. The other 2 crossing locations, nobody's even made it across. So he doesn't know that yet. But they're trying to cross where he is, and there were lots of issues going on. They don't get across. They only get 2,400 troops across where Washington was, but they don't get across until 4 a.m. They were supposed to be across by midnight. Well, he finally gets across. When he gets across, he gets word that nobody else made it across. And the other army from the north is not coming. So he goes from thinking they have 7,000 or 8,000 troops. We're now down at 2,400 troops going up against maybe 1,500. That numerical advantage has been almost done away with, right? I mean, greatly diminished. But Washington knows if we don't have a victory, we will never be able to get people to sign up for round 2, so we're still going to go. So they determined they're going to advance all night or the remainder of the night, and they got a 9-mile march. As they're going on this 9-mile march, to make matters worse, as they're marching, a blizzard rolls in on them. Now, there's no way they're going to make it in time, and now there's a blizzard, which just makes it more miserable. And to even add some context, when you signed up for the Continental Army back then, whether you signed up in January, February, March, April, May, you signed up with the clothes you were wearing. The military didn't give you clothes. So when winter comes, they're not giving out winter jackets. You have whatever you signed up with, and many of the American soldiers had worn through their clothes. In fact, even the boots they were wearing, they'd worn through their boots. The British documented that they could track the American movements in winter by the bloody footprints in the snow, because there were many Americans who didn't have shoes anymore, wrapping their feet in cloth or going barefoot. And now a blizzard rolls in. And right, if you put yourself in that position, I'm always like, God, why? Like, why would I'm trying to do a good thing. Why is this happening? Well, what they didn't know at that time is the blizzard was also happening at Trenton. And as it was happening at Trenton, there were actually, let me back up, 2 of the Americans actually froze to death. This is how serious the conditions were. But as this is happening, there were actually guards on duty in Trenton. And as the blizzard hits, they go to their commanding officer, their CO, and they say, sir, surely nobody's crazy enough to be out doing operations in this kind of weather. Can we please come in and stay warm? And their commanding officer agreed, said, yeah, nobody's going to be doing operations now. Y'all come in and stay warm. The Americans are never going to make it before the light of the next day, so they're not going to be able to secretly approach the fort, except there's now no guards on duty, and everybody is in staying warm by the fire. So nobody's even watching. So they arrive late, but when they get there, they're in position around 8 a.m. When they announced themselves, it was a complete surprise, and this surprise was so significant that as the battle unfolds, the battle ended after only 35 minutes. They were against an army in an entrenched position, in a fort, and it lasted 35 minutes. It should have lasted hours, if not days, maybe even weeks, when you're in an entrenched position, and yet it was over after 35 minutes. And what got even crazier for them, the Hessians were fighting on the British side, right? So the Hessian mercenaries, but Team British. On Team England, there were approximately 20 killed, approximately 100 wounded, and approximately 1,000 captured. On the American side, there were 3 wounded, period. And this is when they're like, wow, that went so well. Like, this was incredible, right? Well, let me go even further, because of the 3 that were wounded, 2 of them came from the same there was a smaller unit that was sent out when they come into Trenton. Washington sent this small detachment and said, hey, you go guard the road on the way out of Trenton, because we want to make sure no loyalists, they can't leave town and go alert the other British forces of what's happening, and then they send reinforcements and we're in trouble. Make sure nobody leaves town. Well, as they are going, they go to the edge of town, but there was a farmhouse they passed. And at the farmhouse, there was a dog that started barking. And it was the dog of John Riker. But this isn't just John Riker, he was Dr. John Riker. He comes to the door, what's going on? And they said, sir, right, we mean you no harm, stay inside. We're just making sure nobody leaves town. We're the American forces advancing on Trenton. And when he hears what they're doing, he says, hey, I'm Team Patriot, I'm Team America. And if you're going, he says, I'm a doctor. And his quote was, some poor fellow may need my assistance. So he got his medical kit, and he went with them. And when the Battle of Trenton unfolds, this detachment now, they come back and they join in the assault. And as they get back, the top officer of this small detachment, he was wounded approaching. Well, there was a young officer there. The young officer, he stepped forward, and as he stepped forward leading this group, he was shot, but this one was considered a fatal injury. He was shot in the shoulder, but through the shoulder, and it came in and it nicked an artery in his chest. This guy was about to bleed out and die. Except the guy standing right beside him was a doctor. And the doctor, actually, not to be too graphic, but as a guy, I appreciate this on some level. The doctor sees him like leaking blood profusely, puts his finger in the hole to slow down the bleed. The doctor ends up saving this guy's life, okay? Well, who was this young officer? If you've ever seen the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, he's the guy standing behind George Washington. He's a known individual, went on to become very famous. He went on to become the 5th president of the United States. His name was James Monroe. Now, again, in the whole context, people are like, so you're telling me that we had 7,000 to 8,000 people supposed to be there, and our forces are so diminished, and we go, and then we're delayed, but there's no guards on duty, and we show up, and it's 35 minutes, and there's only 3 of us that are wounded, and like we captured or killed all of them, and that the guy that was only fatally wounded, the only reason he didn't die is because as the detachment went out, the one dog that barked was the dog of the doctor, and the doctor standing right beside the only, like, they're hearing all this and they're like, this is crazy. And this is where they concluded, I think God's helping us. Like, I think God's on our side. This is what was so obvious that everyone who was there talked about God's providence in this. And remember the guy who was in charge of the crossing where Washington was? His name is General Henry Knox. Here's part of what he wrote about that morning. He said, the hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump will sound, which is part of what the Apostle Paul writes. Like when the return of Christ, it's going to be crazy. People don't even know what's happening. He's like, that's kind of how it felt that morning. He continued, providence seemed to have smiled upon every part of this enterprise. The guys who were there said it was so obvious. God was helping everything we did. The reason I'm pointing this out is because if you know the story of America from the people who were there, they wrote so much about how clear it was that God was moving. And of course, why wouldn't they think that? They've been praying and asking for God to intervene. Just a year later, George Washington writes General Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia a letter. And Washington explains, it's incredible, all of the things we've been seeing, how much God's been showing up on our behalf. Well, here's part of what he wrote explaining that. He said, the hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. Meaning, if someone looks and they can't see that God has been moving on our behalf, they have to be worse than a non-believer or more than wicked if they can't acknowledge what God's been doing. That's how clear it was. Well, his next line of this letter, he says, but it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases, and therefore I shall add no more on the doctrine of providence. Washington's like, I've seen enough miracles, I can become a pastor. But for right now, I'm gonna focus on what we're doing and winning this war. Like, this is his sentiment, okay? This is why, if we actually studied the story from the guys who were there, from their writings, it would actually make sense. Why would John Adams say something like the general principles on which his father's independence were the principles of Christianity? Because if you know the story, you would see it. Well, here's one last example. The American Revolution came to an end when these 3 Americans signed the Peace Treaty of Paris in 1783. On the left is John Jay, the middle is John Adams, and the right is Benjamin Franklin. The document they signed ending the American Revolution, it's actually on display in Washington, D.C. today. It's in the State Department. It's up on the 6th floor. It's called the John Quincy Adams State Drawing Room. If you see on the left, it says Article 10 because there are 10 articles. If you go down, there's several signatures. The top one with the blue ribbon is David Hartley. He was a British ambassador. But then you have John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay. This is the document that ended the American Revolution. It brought peace between us and Great Britain. It established America as a free and independent nation. Look at the title of this document. It says, in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Do you know that America became a nation in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit? It's literally on the top of the document that I would venture to say most of us have never seen. This is significant. See, if we actually studied history and saw what they actually wrote and did, we might have a very different perspective today of even why America became a nation. Because had it not been for God, or like John Adams says, has it not been for the principles of Christianity, they would never have come together. The founding fathers came together on those principles. And as I say this, I would encourage you, please don't take my word on any of this. The reason I've tried to tell you who the letters were to and maybe who wrote the letters, I want you to go look this up. And even on our website, we have a website, wallbuilders.com. We have written over 1,000 articles and footnoted so many things. We have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from American history of any private collector, right? I mean, it's more than 100,000 documents from early American history, almost all of them from before 1812. And so we try to point people back to the original writings. We actually have written a couple of history books where we actually tell so many of these stories. Well, there's more than 1,000 footnotes in the back of both of these. And the reason we footnote everything is because we don't want anybody to take our word for it. In fact, I would encourage you, again, like, please don't trust me on this. Be skeptical. Be like, I don't think that dude's telling the truth. Yeah, go look it up. The reason is, part of the problems we're experiencing in our nation today, it's because we've just been taking people's word for way too long, and there have been dishonest people that have been presenting dishonest information, and we've never gone to look it up and confirm it. And also, to go further, right, as Christians, as believers, if you go to Acts 17, it's where the Apostle Paul is before the Bereans, and he's sharing about Jesus. Well, there's no New Testament yet, because he hasn't written the majority of it. So there's no New Testament. He's trying to tell them about Jesus, and so he's going back to some of the prophecies. And I can imagine he probably goes to like Isaiah, and he's like, guys, we know Isaiah prophesied about the coming Messiah. And he tells them what Isaiah says. And they're like, I'm not sure we can trust this guy. And they say, somebody get the scroll of Isaiah. And they do. They bring out a scroll of Isaiah, and they look, and they're like, oh, that is what it says. Okay, Paul, you may continue, right? Well, thank you. Okay, well, we know the prophet Joel prophesied. And they're like, wait a second. Somebody get the scroll of Joel. We don't trust this guy. That's literally what happens. It says they would not believe anything Paul said until they had looked it up and confirmed for themselves. Paul later praises them. You guys will never be misled because you are always finding truth, right? This is one of the problems in our modern culture is we've just been taking somebody's word and we haven't paid enough attention to realize that there were dishonest and disingenuous people. And so, like, even some of the stories I've already told, this is not even historically disputed stuff. This is from their actual writings. It's not taught anymore. Right now, we might ask why. Do we not want people to know that America never became a nation had it not been for God's intervention or the founding fathers, people who believed in God and prayed and asked for God to help? Let me close by giving a couple thoughts from the founding fathers. If you look, for example, George Washington, he delivered what's considered the most significant political address ever given by any president. It was known as his farewell address. He's been president 2 years at the end, or 2 terms. At the end of his second term, he delivers all of his advice and guidance to the future generations, to the future of America. And here's part of what he wrote. He said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the true patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Now, a couple of things to note. In his long farewell address, it's a big speech or big writing, there's only one time he says something is an indispensable support. Indispensable support means you can't do it without it. You have to have this. There's only one thing he said you have to have, religion and morality. And if you actually read his writings or any of the founders' writings, they were very clear on what religion and morality meant. Religion, it wasn't ambiguous for any religion. No, it was Christianity unequivocally. And morality, the thing you find the most often in their writings when they're encouraging morality, they say the top 2 places to learn morality is from the 10 Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. That's the best 2 standards of morality. But why this matters? When they say religion and morality, they're literally saying without Christianity, without the teachings of the Bible, Washington said, those are the indispensable supports. And in vain would that man claim the attributed patriotism who should labor to subvert these. If people oppose this, they don't love America. If you love America, you ought to be supporting, promoting Christianity in the Bible. Well, the following year, John Adams becomes president. John Adams, he then, the next year, he writes a letter to the militia of Massachusetts. And here's part of what he wrote in that letter. Very famous line. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Now, he says our Constitution, our system of government only works with religion and morality. Why? Because in our system of government, we believe in giving freedom to the people. But freedom only works if you have immoral people. Because what happens if you give freedom to immoral people? That's Chicago every weekend, right? Like, that's not very good. That's what they knew, right? Our government, our American experiment, it only works with Christianity and the Bible. This is what they were so clear on, and yet today, this is a big deal. I'm watching even Christians think that the solution for all of our problems, we just need to have a different political candidate. Now, by the way, I'm not speaking negatively of that, because I have some ideas on that as well, right? But I just want to point out, when you change political leaders, if you do not restore religion and morality, all a new leader can do is slow the decay down. They don't change it unless we go back to religion and morality. And let me give you some thoughts from the Bible on this. If you look at Psalms 127, verse 1, it says, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. What does that mean? If God's not a part, it ain't going to work. You choose a different leader if you want to, but if God's not a part, it's not going to work. Well, let me go further. Because then in Proverbs 14:34, it says that righteousness exalts a nation, but sins reproach any people. So what makes a nation great? Because there's this slogan, make America great again. I am not opposed to that slogan. I just understand you cannot make her great again if you don't know what made her great in the first place. Okay? It also matters that we have political leaders that understand this too, right? Now, this is where, speaking of God's providence, right? If anybody paid attention to the news yesterday, there's no doubt. God is still part of the story of what's happening in America. There's no doubt about it. But the challenge for us as Christians, we have to have more understanding and maybe more insightfulness than other people because we should know truth better. Well, truth tells us this is what makes a nation great. Again, why does this matter? Because if we're looking for political solutions, if we're looking for cultural solutions, we have to be smart enough to recognize where they come from. And also smart enough to recognize if we need more righteousness, if we need more religion and morality, we're not going to find that from non-believers. The only hope, the only solution is what the solution's always been. It's the people of God. It's the church. Our nation would never have existed if it were not for people who knew there was a God, crying out for God, and then working to be used by God to help bring freedom for their kids and grandkids. I can tell you, the future of America will never happen in the way that we hope and pray it does unless we once again have people of God who know there's a God, praying to be used by God, standing up for freedom for their kids and grandkids, right? But again, the reason this matters is because the foundation of our nation was that there was a God and we tried to follow those standards. The only future for a nation, especially one where there is freedom, freedom only works if there's religion and morality, which means that our nation only continues to exist if the church can once again figure out our role. And I'm saying this at a time when we're seeing denominations split over whether or not they believe the Bible is true, right? We are wanting to see a revival in the nation. We'll never see a revival in the nation if we don't first have a revival in the church. But once we have a church that recognizes there is a God and he's revealed truth in his word and we will stand on his word. See, God's word is the solution for relationships, for marriages, for families, for communities, and for nations. And I'm not upset that the heathen don't know that. I just am ready for Christians who do know it to start standing up and being a little more vocal about the real hope for our nation is Jesus and the Bible. Thank you guys for letting me share.